everyone. For our last session of today, we're delighted to have Dr. Notte again speaking to us regarding Russia's relations with the Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Notte is a senior research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, where she focuses on Russian foreign policy as well as arms control and non-proliferation in the Middle East, among other issues. She has previously been a non-resident scholar at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at Monterey and has worked on track 2 dialogues related to the Middle East region. Dr. Notte has lectured on Russian foreign policy in the Middle East, including at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, the American University of Paris, and our own Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and is regularly invited to speak at international events and conferences on the subject. Dr. Notte, it's a pleasure to have you with us to speak about Russia's relations with the MENA region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me and see my presentation, my slides? Yes, okay. Great. Well, it's good to be with you again, and I realize I'm the last one of the day, so you might already be quite tired sitting through these virtual presentations, which is why I thought I'd shake things up a bit and have a PowerPoint presentation, because I think it's easier not just to listen, but also to have something visual to look at. And I'll start with this slide. President Biden is going to Saudi Arabia this week. That is catching some by surprise and making the Democrats quite angry in the United States, because it was Biden's pledge, during the campaign, to be hard on Saudi, given the human rights records, the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist. Yet he's going now. And he even found the need to explain why he is going. President Biden published an op-ed this weekend in the Washington Post explaining why he's going to Saudi Arabia this week. And I'm just going to quote to you from this op-ed for a second. He says in this op-ed, "As president, it is my job to keep our country strong and secure. We have to counter Russia's aggression, put ourselves in the best possible position to outcompete China. And to do these things, we have to engage directly with countries that can impact those outcomes. Saudi Arabia is one of them." So what Biden's really doing in this op-ed is he's framing his visit, his engagement with Riyadh, as part of being of great power competition, ultimately saying we have to engage with Saudi because Saudi is a player to be reckoned with when it comes to our ability as the United States to deal with Russia and China. Now, why is he saying this? Why is he doing this? Well, it's been the perception of the United States and the West more broadly since February 2022 that a lot of countries in the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, have been somewhat sitting on the fence when it comes to the war in Ukraine. The Americans turned to Saudi Arabia in particular, but Gulf nations more broadly, to ask them to help drive down oil prices after the invasion started by pumping more oil. And the Gulf states essentially said, no, thank you very much. We have no interest in doing that. Countries in the region have not joined sanctions against Russia. If you look at the voting record of countries in the Middle East and North Africa at the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly regarding Ukraine, that has also been very mixed picture. Most infamously, the Emirati abstention from one of the early Security Council resolutions, which really antagonized many in Washington. So there's basically this perception that this region is outsitting the war in Ukraine, definitely not showing real support for Western countries, for Ukraine, and that therefore you have to engage in diplomatic efforts to try to change that attitude. Nikolai Kozhanov gave a lecture a few hours ago explaining how the region looks at Russia and what might explain some of this hedging or fence sitting, whatever you want to call it. And so the purpose of this lecture today is to turn the picture around and ask, what are Russian interests in this region? What is Russian strategy and tactics to pursue those interests in the region? Sort of building on this more narrow conversation that I just had with Galip Dalay on Turkey. So this is what we'll do in this lecture. I want to look at interest and strategy, sort of over the last few years as I see them across the region. But I do want to try and spend 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the lecture to just focus on the nexus between the Ukraine war and the Middle East, because with concerns about grain exports, that region is particularly vulnerable, also to rising energy prices. And so I think it's quite significant to look at that. So let's start with interest, and perhaps what I want to start with is to situate the Middle East and its importance within sort of broader Russian foreign policy in the last few years. I mean, I think the first thing to say here is that there's been relatively little focus on the MENA region in official Russian strategic documents. If you look at the 2016 Russian foreign policy concept, for instance, there's only scant mention of the Middle East region. If you compare that to former Soviet states, and if the Middle East is mentioned, it's mostly in relation to counterterrorism or counterproliferation, rather than sort of as a region in its own right. And the same applies to the national security strategy that was published in the summer of 2021. I mean, I think it's literally in bullet point 37 that there is a mention of the Middle East for the first time in this document. But that, relative absence of the reason in official strategic documents runs somewhat counter to the de facto significance that this region has had for Russian foreign policy in recent years. I mean, building on the military intervention in Syria in 2015, becoming more active in Libya, you can effectively say that Russia now has a seat at every table at any given conflict in the region. If you look at the sheer diplomatic activity that Russian MFA and diplomats have engaged in, there's a significant increase. I think Kommersant at some point wrote an article where they counted the number of meetings that Lavrov and other senior officials had with Middle Eastern counterparts in the 2010 to 2015 timeframe, and then 2015 to 2020. And there was a huge increase. And that has also led to a change in perception among regionals of Russia, that Russia is a country to be reckoned with in the region. And why is this happening, this increasing Russian activism in the region? Of course, it's building on the intervention in Syria, which we can speak about more, but I think it's more broadly underpinned by a Russian worldview, according to which Russia is operating in an increasingly multipolar world where a lot of powers have leverage, where it finds itself in a protracted confrontation with the West, with a declining West, as Moscow believes. I mean, this is not new thinking since the Ukraine war. This is thinking that has been crystallizing over years, and where Russia needs to countenance attempts by the West to isolate and to weaken Russia. And so in this unstable, multipolar world that is very much in flux, the Russian leadership has believed in the need to diversify relations. And if you need to diversify relations, the MENA region has occupied an important place in this framework, because you have legacy in that region. The Soviets were quite active in the Middle East and had important relations there. And you still have a military base in Syria and a perceived successful military intervention in that region. So something to build upon, some basis from which to project power militarily, economically, and diplomatically. And so I would say still the MENA region doesn't rise to the level of importance in Russian foreign policy overall compared to post-Soviet space, China, Europe, perhaps even the Arctic. I think Russian academics would perhaps even put Russian strategic interest in the Arctic over the long term above the MENA region, but still it has become more and more important. And, I think even since the beginning of the Ukraine invasion in February, Russia has actually been quite active diplomatically to keep things going in the Middle East. I mean, partially perhaps this is also a function of Russia being now very isolated from the West, being shunned diplomatically. So there's not a whole lot of engagement going on with Western capitals. But Lavrov, I think he's been to Bahrain and to Saudi. He invited all the Arab League foreign ministers to Moscow. They came as early as April. A lot of actually Middle Eastern dignitaries have been to Moscow since the beginning of this war. So there's a lot of diplomacy going on there. So against this backdrop, I want to sort of ask, well, what are more specific Russian interests in the MENA region? And I want to start with security. I think when Russia intervened in Syria in September 2015, there was a lot of concern at the time about Russian-speaking foreign fighters having joined the war in Syria, but also some, were in Iraq from the Russian Federation and the post-Soviet space. I remember I was based at Carnegie Moscow at that time, and I was doing a project I was supposed to track through Telegram and social media and sort of what Russian human rights activists with Memorial and others were doing. I was doing this comprehensive picturing of Russian-speaking foreign fighters going to fight in Syria, which was a pretty interesting project to engage in. And the numbers that were given at the time was, there are thousands going, and they could be coming back and pose a threat to Russia and its neighborhood. Now, we can have a whole different debate about the extent to which those threats were actually real as opposed to fabricated by the Russian authorities, and to what extent they explain the timing of the Russian military intervention in Syria. I think there's question marks about this. But this nexus between extremism, terrorism, instability in the Middle East, and I think Russia and its neighborhood, that is a longstanding, I think, issue in Russian threat perceptions when it comes to this region. But I do still want to unpack this a little bit more and suggest to you that there are, from a security perspective, bad things coming from the Middle East to Russia. There are perhaps 4 prisms that we can apply to look at this. First of all is the Russian prism on state order in the Middle East, if you want to call it this way. I had over the years many conversations with Russian diplomats on the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings, because I was working in track 2 diplomacy on the Syrian conflict for years and, engaging with Russian MFA on this. And usually if you talk to Russian diplomats about this, the story goes something along those lines. They say that the Western response to the Arab uprising was a form of social political engineering, that the West intruded in the socio-political fabric of those countries. Yes, there were grievances. Yes, perhaps people were going on the street because of those grievances, but then the West came in to amplify those. And therefore, something very fragile in these countries, statehood, which is not very long-standing and robust in many of these countries in the Middle East, was basically weakened or undermined from outside, because the West then wanted to force very rapid democratization, enforce regime change from without. So goes the Russian narrative. Russian diplomats would say that after the Second World War, you had many nationalist dictatorships in the Middle East, Iraq, Egypt, Syria, holding together very diverse societies, if we look at sort of tribal relation, ethnicity, religion, but still these regimes tried to managed to keep things stable by balancing between Islam and tribal relations as sort of fundamental pillars of these societies. And then when the Arab Spring came and this outside intrusion and encouragement of rapid change, that fragile balance was broken by the West. And so some states were destroyed and have not recovered since then, such as Libya, and others are still really struggling, like Egypt or Iraq. And so this whole notion was, I think, epitomized by something one Russian diplomat once said to me, which about Syria. This is a conversation about Syria. He said to me, statehood is a very complex thing in the Middle East. It's like a Mercedes engine. It's perhaps it's easy to take apart, but it's very difficult to put again together. So I think this kind of idea on statehood in the Middle East and on developments in Syria has been quite central to how Russian diplomats look at the situation. Don't dismantle existing institutions, even if there are problems with these regimes, even if they in terms of the human rights record or democracy are not the most laudable examples. Don't dismantle institutions unless you know what will come after, because otherwise you will risk instability, fragmentation, a vacuum at the core, and all the attendant consequences, including the spillover of extremism, even beyond the borders of those states. So that's what I mean by this state order prism on this slide. Then I think the Libya experience was quite formative in that story in terms of how Russia looked at the region. we can just briefly sort of recapture history here. It was in March 2011 that the Security Council adopted Resolution 1973, which authorized the no-fly zone over Libya, and which gave an unprecedented mandate under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter for the use of military force for humanitarian purposes in Libya against the wishes of the state. And you will recall that Russia abstained in that vote under then President Medvedev in the spring of 2011 for reasons that, you know, experts and scholars have suggested perhaps had more to do with the reset and Obama-Medvedev US-Russian relations and perhaps expectations of what that could translate into rather than with Libya narrowly. But then as this Security Council resolution was implemented, Russia became increasingly critical, especially as the campaign expanded and led to the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And, you know, discussing Syria with analysts and interlocutors in Moscow as early as 2012, 2013, 2014, even before the Russian intervention, this grievance over what happened in Libya was really, really profound, I felt. You know, the fact that they had abstained in the Security Council and now Gaddafi was gone. I think Putin himself in his rhetoric talked about a medieval ouster of Gaddafi and was very aggrieved by what had happened. So I think this Libya prism became quite important. And after Libya, there was going to be no more acceptance of quote unquote, you know, regime change forced from the outside. Russia was drawing a red line and was not going to let this scenario materialize in Syria. But of course, perhaps it's also Russia's own historical experience that further sort of feeds into those narratives and into those prisms. We have the legacy of the Chechen Wars, perhaps a perception that especially, that crystallized in Moscow in the 90s, but that became especially pertinent for President Putin in the context of the Second Chechen War, that if you lose control at the center, if you have a weak central state, as Russia had in the 1990s when things were quite volatile, that you will have chaos, instability, perhaps even civil war and fragmentation at the periphery in the North Caucasus. And I think the way that he looked at the Chechen Wars also significantly influenced the way he looked at Syria and the prospect of the Assad regime losing central control in Damascus I guess 10 years, decades later. And I would say that there's finally also a linkage between events in the Middle East, or how Moscow looks at them after the Arab uprisings, and its own neighborhood. This whole idea that you do not want to allow for more precedents of successful regime change to happen in the Middle East, because they could serve as an example in your own neighborhood. That is something we do find actually in the Russian discourse quite early on. So if you look at the reactions in Moscow to the Rose Revolution in Georgia in, I guess, 2005, and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, even then you see some Russians arguing that the West is quote unquote sort of practicing regime change, or, you know, supporting democratization in order to eventually enforce this scenario against Russia itself. And sorry, my point is, at the same time, you also have uprisings in the Middle East. You have the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon in 2005, as you have also events in the post-Soviet space. And even then, there's Russians who are arguing, this is what the Americans are doing in the Middle East, and they will, you know, they will practice essentially, and they might enforce similar scenarios in our own privileged sphere of influence. Of course, I think after Libya, Bolotnaya Square protests, Putin returning to the presidency, which also happens at the same time as the wars in Libya and Syria heat up, that nexus in the Russian narrative between what happens in the Middle East and is the product of American foreign policy and what happens in the post-Soviet space becomes more pronounced, but we see it already earlier on. So I think my bottom line here on the security interests from a Russian perspective is that there's kind of two dimensions to this. First of all, you want to prevent regime change in the region, and you want to maintain the status quo, because Russian diplomats genuinely believe that slow, incremental change within existing orders is preferable for this region. I think they genuinely believe that. They don't believe in Western attempts at democratizing the region. But they also are against regime change because they don't want to see any kinds of precedents that can serve as a model for Russia's own neighborhood. So there's these two dimensions going on. But then there is an additional security interest that has become more pronounced, I would say, in the last few years. And that is not about countering threats from within the Middle East region that could affect Russia, but it is about using the region, using Russia's regional presence in order to push back against NATO. So by being militarily based in Syria now and having the naval port in Tartus and the airbase in Hmeimim and creating anti-access area denial assets there, Russia has essentially made Syria part of what you could call an arc of deterrence, where Russia can effectively circumscribe NATO access and freedom of operation into the Eastern Mediterranean, giving it a possibility to push back against NATO, poke American forces in Syria, which is something that we've frequently seen in the last few years, in order to show displeasure with something that might be going on in another theater, that might be going on in Europe. So basically, Russia in the last few years has demonstrated in Syria, by also the military hardware and the kinds of ships and missiles and fighter jets that it deployed to Syria, that it can basically very quickly create a situation in which it can cause some trouble for NATO troops, contest NATO military operations and exercises in order to make a point about something else. And that is something where now the big question mark is, how will that strategy play out in this new era of even heightened confrontation between Russia and the West over Ukraine? How will the Russians play their presence in the Middle East? Will they be risk averse, or will they lash out? And that is something, I think, where the jury is still out, what will happen going forward. I want to turn to economic interests for a minute, which to my mind are secondary to the security interests that Russia has in the region, but they are still significant. So, as part of this quest to diversify relations more broadly, Russia has also sought to diversify economic relations, especially, I would say, since the annexation of Crimea and the sanctions that were introduced against Russia over that. And Russia has managed to increase its trade with most countries in the Middle East, but it's still really on a modest basis. And I think the Middle East still only makes up for just under 10%, like 8 or 9%, the whole region, in terms of Russia's share of foreign exports. A lot of that trade, as I said earlier, is with Turkey. Israel is also significant, not with the Arab countries with which the Soviet Union had important relations. I think in 2019, Turkey had overtaken Italy as the largest trading partner for Russia in the Mediterranean. In North Africa, trade relations with Egypt and Algeria are important, but still, it's fairly, it's a fairly small share in terms of Russia's overall GDP. And that is perhaps because the structure of the economic exchange between Russia and the MENA region is fairly simple. Russia exports mostly metals, grain, wheat, foodstuffs to the region, and it imports some fruit, vegetables, and textiles. But Russia doesn't actually produce a whole lot of goods and services that countries in the region want to consume. There are two areas where Russia is very competitive, and I'll turn to those in a second. But Russia is also not a significant investor in the region, unlike China. The two areas in which Russia is more competitive is arms sales and the building of nuclear power plants. So I'll just say a few words on those. I think these are SIPRI numbers from the latest overview that they do of arms exports and imports globally, released earlier. And you see just like in any year, countries in the Middle East are among the most, the biggest arms importers, unfortunately, globally. So together they make up for a fairly significant share. And Russia has been selling a lot of arms to the Middle East over the last decade. I think about 50% of Russian arms exports go to that region. Air defense systems, attack helicopters, tanks go mostly to those clients. And Algeria, fascinatingly, Egypt and Iraq are among the most important clients in the region. And why is it that these states are buying Russian weapons? There's a sort of multiple reasons, but one is that the Russian weapons, especially if you then compare it to American or French systems, are usually lower price, sometimes also easier to use compared to perhaps more sophisticated Western systems. They don't come with the same onerous procurement rules. A system in the US has to go through Congress and be approved, and there might be strings attached and human rights considerations. I mean, the big question now with Biden going to Saudi is whether the US might resume certain weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. Russia doesn't ask these kinds of questions of its clients. So this has been a driving factor, but also, quite frankly, the fact that Middle Eastern countries just want to have some leverage. They want to have a card to play. And so they want to be able to say to the United States, we don't just need you, we can also buy stuff from Russia and from China. So it's been part of this overall hedging. Turning to the export of nuclear technology, there Russia is an important player in the region. Rosatom is a massive company, and the Middle East region accounts for a significant portfolio of Rosatom's global orders, which amount to hundreds of billions of US dollars for the next 10 years. The Russians entered this field when they took over the construction of the Bushehr reactor in Iran in the 90s. And then they signed in 2010 an agreement with Turkey to build the Akuyu power plant, which I already mentioned in the panel. But they're also building Egypt's first nuclear power plant. And they have concluded a lot of cooperation agreements and memoranda of understanding really with a lot of countries in the region. So they're trying to position themselves really in this market. I'll quickly mention the other economic interests that Russia has in the region. There's grain exports, which are a lot in the news now. The vulnerability of Middle Eastern countries to Russian and Ukrainian grain exports, especially Egypt, Algeria, but I guess also Lebanon and others. I'll come back to this at the end of the lecture when we talk about the Ukraine war. But this slide gives you somewhat of an indication of what we're talking about. The next issue is tourism. Again, I mentioned this already, but Russian tourists like to go to Turkey and they like to go to Egypt, and that has been quite significant for the Egyptian and Turkish economies. I will just quickly tell you that you might remember that in October 2015, this is 1 month into the Russian intervention in Syria, a Russian passenger plane was shot down over the Sinai. And I think 200 Russian tourists died. And at that point, the Russians stopped all direct flights to Sharm el-Sheikh, I think even to Cairo. And for years, there was basically this investigation of safety at Egyptian airports. And by now, of course, direct flights to Cairo have long resumed, but the Egyptians were really lobbying very heavily the Russian side to resume those flights because there were no more Russian tourists coming to Sharm el-Sheikh. And this was really biting into the Egyptian tourist industry. So these things can be quite significant. Now, just one quick word about energy. Since the Middle East itself is an important producer of oil and gas and sells that to the world, it's essentially a competitor to Russia in this field. And so what Russia has tried to do in recent years is basically to partner or to gain a foothold in exploration and development of hydrocarbons in the region. I think calculating that, if you have stakes in certain projects in the region, you will have at least some influence over the delivery decisions of those countries, for instance, to the European market. So Gazprom, Rosneft, Lukoil, they've been active in the KRG, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, Lukoil also in the south, in Tripoli, in Libya, and in other countries. And speaking of the energy sector, this is another Russian interest. alignment and coordination with partners in the OPEC plus format, especially with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, has been a really significant interest of Russia vis-a-vis those countries, to seek alignment on oil production quotas and hence be able to drive market prices. The last thing I'll say on economic interest is just another word on financial ties. So if you look at official development assistance that the Russians give to the region, this is clearly not a major tool of Russian policy in the Middle East. I think especially compared to China and what assistance China is able to give to the region, and it really makes it an important financial and economic player. And this is in contrast to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gave large development assistance to countries in the Middle East, and that was a tool of influence. Then in the 90s, Russia turned into a net recipient of development aid, but it's never really emerged as a donor again in the region. What the Russians did do is write off some of the debt, Soviet era debt that countries had with Russia, Iraq, Syria, and others. But broadly, because Russia realized that these countries were never going to be able to repay that debt anyway. So you might as well write off the debt. But otherwise, Russia is not a financial player in the region. To the contrary, it's tried to attract Gulf investment in the Russian economy with more or less success in recent years, especially from the Emirates and from Qatar. The final interest I just want to mention as a sort of standalone category is what I would call prestige and power projection. I think there's something going on here that is separate from the security interest, which is offering an alternative vision to regional order from the United States and using the Middle East to do that. So there's been a certain interest in Russian diplomacy in the Middle East to sort of educate the West or others about legitimate and effective ways to produce stability and conflict resolution, both interstate and then at the societal level. And to do that, to reinforce this broader narrative about the West's decline in the world. And I think this is, we saw this reflected in the 2021 National Security Strategy, which put a lot more aspects on the moral and ethical aspects of national security, talked a lot about Russian values. Also, you might recall this Putin speech at the latest Valdai conference in Sochi in October, where he talked about Russia representing a healthy conservatism in the world. It was a speech in which he criticized the West for the culture of wokeness, and attacked, feminism, the transgender community, cancel culture, what he called quote unquote reverse racism, all those things, to basically say we in Russia stand for a healthy conservatism. And I think this narrative does resonate in certain parts of the Middle East, which is also still quite a conservative region. And perhaps the Orthodox Church, at least in some, quarters of the Middle East, has also sought to sort of reinforce this value-based narrative. In the Middle East, Russia is really always trying to portray itself as this defender of stability, a guarantor of order, a defender of religious minorities. So I think this whole narrative fits into that. So much for interests. And now I do want to turn just for a little bit to strategy and tactics, I call it. So how does Russia go about pursuing those interests in the region? And the first thing I want to say, and I'm repeating here a point that Nikolai made in his lecture and that I agree with, is that Russia doesn't have a grand strategy for the region. Nothing like a sort of US grand strategy or overarching organizing principle for its foreign policy, whether that was containment during the Cold War or the global war on terror after 9/11. And certainly Russia doesn't have that for the Middle East. When Russia has kind of certain strategic concepts for the region, and it has one for the Gulf area, for instance, which was written a long time ago, and then it's being brought out again and dusted off and offered as a basis for, diplomacy. These concepts are really kind of declaratory at a very general high level. They don't tell you how you would get from A to B to C. They're really just a very broad narrative. And so what one Russian once said to me to kind of sum up this issue is that a Russian strategy for the Middle East doesn't exist, but it works. So somehow what Russia does works. And there are certain characteristics or tools that Russia has in the MENA region. And I do want to perhaps briefly go through those. So the first I would call flexible partnerships and equidistance. And this flexible alliances concept is actually something you do find in Russian strategic documents, this paradigm that basically you need case-by-case diplomacy with a relevant player to solve an issue at hand. Those players can change. They don't have to be static over time. What matters is that a player has real leverage on the ground. You will talk with whomever has leverage, whether those are actors that you disagree with or find problematic. Maybe you consider them terrorists when we come to the Middle East, but you will engage with them anyway. So this is what the Russians said in the 2016 foreign policy concept. They talked about network diplomacy as having gained prominence, and that Russia will actively support the emergence of such alliances and will participate in them. And Maria Khudinskaya, who's a Russian diplomat who used to work the Syria file from Geneva, so that's how I engaged with her. Now I think she's at the MFA in Moscow. She kind of fleshed this out a bit more regarding the Syrian case. She sort of said that Russia has realized that it needs to pursue flexible alliances by optimizing the players which have real leverage on the ground. And in order to do this, Russia needs a free hand. It shouldn't be constrained by sort of this block relationship thinking that was characteristic of the way that the Soviet Union dealt with the Middle East. This brings us to the idea of equidistance. So what is required for Russia to pursue these flexible alliances is to walk balancing acts between mutually antagonistic players in the Middle East. If you look at the Middle East region, it's just full of actors that have conflicts with each other. And Russia is talking with everyone and dealing with everyone. So it has to always navigate between those players and try to not, antagonize one side too much over the other. And we can point to various examples of Russia having done this in the recent years. So first example of a flexible partnership is the Astana Troika, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, which have dealt with each other since the beginning of 2016 after the fall of Aleppo in Syria. I think over time, it is fair to say, this is something that Galeb pointed to when he talked about Syria, that Russia's relations with these Astana Troika partners have become more important when it comes to Syria than to deal with the West for Russia. I think the Russians concluded in 2017 that there was no finding of a modus vivendi or some sort of solution with the West or with the United States in particular on Syria. So you just drop it and you just deal with who's actually on the ground, the Iranians and the Turks. Of course, you also deal with the Israelis because they're striking at Iranian targets in Syria. You deal with that separately, but otherwise Russia put all its eggs into the Astana Troika basket, but still staying flexible. So here I show you the Astana Troika with Rouhani, Erdogan, and Putin. But then in early 2021, Russia shook up that format, and instead of the Iranians, invited the Qataris and had a Russian-Turkish-Qatari meeting to discuss Syria. So there's some flexibility in this approach and how you want to deal with, whatever issue you want to solve. On the equidistance, I think a good example of trying to really walk a fine line between two enemies, and I think when we look at the region, Iran and Israel is as much enmity as it gets in that region. Russia has pursued that fairly successfully in recent years. So just to give you sort of a brief background here, Russia and Iran have been to some extent allies in Syria, fighting together to support the Assad regime. But at the same time, Russia has always tried to be considerate of Israeli security concerns, because to Israel, the Iranian presence in Syria is a main security threat. And under Putin, Russian-Israeli relations evolved, they improved a lot. And so that is something that Putin has tried to be mindful of. Now, what has happened is, as the Syrian government, enabled by Russia, retook more and more territory in this war since 2015, that has allowed the Iranians to entrench themselves more in Syria, especially in the southwest of the country towards the Israeli border. And Israel has become more nervous and impatient. So in recent years, the Israelis have really been striking a lot at Iran-backed proxies, at Hezbollah in Syria. And Israel has constantly been going to Russia and basically said, you need to do more to reduce the Iranian presence in Syria. And Russia would be like, well, we're trying, but Iran is a sovereign country. We can't dictate what they do. And of course, Russia also needs Iran in Syria. So you have this conundrum. How are you going to walk this balancing act? And, for years, experts were saying that at some point, this whole situation is going to blow up and Russia will have to take a stance, either be with the Israelis or be with the Iranians. But that has actually not panned out. Russia has continued to try to just navigate the situation. And basically what happens is, most of the time when Israel strikes at an Iranian target in Syria, even kills some Iranians or Iranian advisors, Russia doesn't say anything. It just ignores the situation. Perhaps in recent months, the Russians have become more vocal. They've become more critical openly of the Israeli striking in Syria, which could have to do with Israel's position over the Ukraine war. So there's something going on here, but otherwise, Russia has tried to maintain equidistance between Israel and the Iranians in Syria. And if we want to talk about equidistance, you can look at many issues in the Middle East and make that case. I think between Israel and the Palestinians, Russia has very much tried to maintain a sort of even-handed position, priding itself on being able to talk with all sorts of Palestinian factions, inviting them to Moscow, trying to be sort of leading in diplomacy on intra-Palestinian reconciliation. The Russians have been quite equidistant between different Libyan players. They've tried to do that between Turkey and Syrian Kurds. When there was a dispute within the Gulf between Qatar and Saudi and the Emirates, you might remember this a few years ago, the Russians were very cautious, trying to be equidistant in order not to antagonize any of these players. So you see it in a lot of kind of arenas in the region. Second tool, I think, is the idea of low-level security provision. So most analysts don't believe that Russia would ever replicate another Syria in the Middle East, meaning, have the appetite for another full-scale military intervention and military presence anywhere in the region. But what Russia has done is position PMC presence, military advisors covertly in a lot of countries, not so much Middle East, but perhaps more North Africa and into Africa, Sudan, Central African Republic, Mali, elsewhere, which are inexpensive to deploy. You have some plausible deniability, though we can debate this because I think Wagner presence is now very much discussed internationally and there's a lot of focus on it. But you can make some money while also sustaining existing regimes. So this is a tool that Russia has deployed. The next thing I want to come to is disinformation, or using hybrid means to sustain influence. I suppose that is the kind of critical lens on it. Russians would talk about their growing soft power in the region, though Nikolai seemed to suggest earlier that Russian soft power reach doesn't go that far. I would tend to agree with him, but there have been some changes in recent years. So on the disinformation, that resonates really quite widely, I would say, in the Middle East. I've followed the Syrian chemical weapons dossier quite a bit, where Russia has really provided a lot of alternative narratives on who used chemical weapons in Syria against whom. And that is disseminated by RT Arabic, but it's also seeping into Arab social media quite a bit. And then I think there's been already some good analysis done on narratives in Arab media on the Ukraine war, and also been found that Russia's narrative on events in Ukraine is being picked up a lot in Arab social media and sort of common media. Besides that, you have Rosatom, which is quite active in the Middle East, actually. I think it's led now by Yevgeny Primakov, the grandson of the diplomat Yevgeny Primakov. And I think Rosatom was active during Soviet times, but a lot of those offices stayed functional after the collapse of the Soviet Union, for instance, in Cairo and Alexandria and in Egypt, but also Syria and Lebanon. There's centers in Palestine, Iran, Israel, Turkey. And I think Primakov, since taking over the agency in June 2020, he's tried to breathe new life into the agency's work. I actually follow him on Telegram, and he shares a lot of content of all that they're doing in sort of all parts of the world. And I put this quote, I believe, for you, where he sort of lays out his vision of the fact that the Russian bear must also smile in the world. That is what they're trying to do. And so in Syria, for instance, there's a lot of activity now where the Russian language is being promoted, Russian education. So of course, if we look at how far this resonates across the Middle East, I think it's still fairly modest, but the Russians understand that the fight for influence is also being fought in that area. And I mean, just to even give some other examples of this soft power projection and trying to do that, after the Russians intervened in Syria and they had stabilized certain areas, they were deploying military police at some point to just stabilize certain areas that had been recaptured from 2017. And the military police that Russia deployed was basically Muslims from the North Caucasus. There would be these rotations of 500 Dagestanis, 500 Chechens, or from Ingushetia as well, being deployed to kind of provide more of a kind of, friendly face and sort of common understanding between the local Syrian population and the military police that was being deployed. And then, of course, Kadyrov has his own networks in the Middle East. This is all perhaps also part of the Russian soft power approach to the region. Okay, perhaps just very quickly, I had a slide on who makes foreign policy in the MENA region. I think you had a session earlier with Elena and Fyodor on who makes Russian foreign policy. I mean, I think when it comes to MENA, this hierarchical spokes and hub model, where it's basically the president that sits at the top and has perhaps more to say than the United States president in formulation of foreign policy. But still, there's all these different actors with their own agendas that seek to have access to the final decisions, I think applies here. So when we think about foreign policy in the Middle East by Russia, you have the MFA and its envoys, the MOD, the intelligence services, other ministries, the energy ministry, and big state corporations like Rosatom, like Rosatom export when it comes to arms exports, big business, the Russian regions, and they all have their parochial interests, but the ultimate arbiter over where policy vis-a-vis a specific conflict or country is headed, I think rests with the leadership in the Kremlin. And I would pose to you that the less important the file, the more leeway these different actors have to pursue their own interests. But once a file rises to the importance that the Kremlin will be paying attention, that room essentially narrows down. So when there's real crisis, like you might remember this spat between Mohammed bin Salman and Putin over the OPEC plus and the oil prices in early 2020, then President Putin will intervene. Or when there's like a crisis with 32 Turkish soldiers getting killed by Russian forces in Idlib in Syria, then you will see President Putin getting involved in diplomacy. So that is my last slide on the tactics. And perhaps I'll just spend 10 minutes quickly on Ukraine and the Middle East before we go into Q&A. And there were just two things I wanted to sort of mention. or talk about briefly, perhaps also as a basis for discussion. One is that, are there differences, parallels, lessons between Russia's military involvement in Syria and now the war in Ukraine that we can point to it that can be instructive in our analysis as we look at the situation in Ukraine and the way forward? I think especially when the war started, there was a lot of sort of questions asked about that. There's, of course, important differences, I would say, in the scale and nature of this war and the stakes for Russia. I think what happened is, because Russia's military intervention in Syria was seen as relatively successful, yes, Russia hasn't produced conflict resolution in Syria, but the Assad regime still stands. The war has largely worn down. Russia perceives itself as having won in Syria. And it is perceived as having been successful in Syria by large parts, I think, of the global South, certainly. There was perhaps an expectation for a different kind of performance by Russia in Ukraine, because militarily speaking, the operation in Syria was relatively successful, but of course it was conducted largely from the air. Russia didn't deploy ground troops in Syria. Yes, special forces, military police at some point, but not ground forces on the scale that we're now seeing in Ukraine. It was also operating in Syria against a much less able opponent, non-state actors on the ground that didn't have the same, defense means as the Ukrainian army has. So I think my point is that Russia's performance in Syria, I think, fueled unrealistic expectations among many, including Western analysts, of how this war in Ukraine would look like. And now we're reassessing and realizing that this is a very different war that should be analyzed in a different way. Nonetheless, I think there are some parallels that we can point to, that we can see. The first is that what we saw in Syria quite often is the announcement of an end of a certain phase of military operation, de-escalation, ceasefire, to then focus on another part of the country, which is something we have seen in Ukraine as well. My point about this is that one should not breathe a sigh of relief or be too optimistic when fighting in a certain part of the conflict is declared as over, because in Syria we saw fighting in the western part of the country stopped. Russia used that opportunity to reorient itself towards the east of the country and enable the regime to retake more, to then turn back on towards the west of the country and retake those other territories later as well. Which is not to say that the same trajectory will happen like this in Ukraine. It's just to point to this pattern of war in phases. The sieges, provision of humanitarian corridors that are then hampered by violence or not trusted by civilians who seek to leave, that is something that we have seen in Syria time and again. Russian disinformation, blaming the other side of using civilians as human shields, the claim about the other side planning false flag operations with chemical weapons. This is stuff that we've seen in Ukraine since February, and we saw it in Syria over years. The use of foreign fighters and mercenaries. Mercenaries for sure, that's a parallel between the conflicts. I guess when it comes to the use of foreign fighters in Ukraine, there was a lot of talk at the beginning, Russia even announcing that there's like hundreds or thousands of volunteers from the Middle East who want to come and fight in Ukraine. If you then looked at the actual, evidence, American intelligence, I think to this day has not confirmed that any Syrian fighters have actually been moved by Russia from Syria to the Ukrainian battlefield. So that hasn't happened yet. And then finally, I would say a dehumanization discourse of a different nature. In Syria, those who took up arms against the Assad regime were labeled terrorists. So there was either you with the regime or you're a terrorist. We had a sort of terrorist discourse, and in Ukraine we have the denazification discourse. In terms of lessons that we can draw, I guess one has to be really cautious because the nature of the conflict is so different, but I pointed kind of in terms of military lesson to perhaps an initial overestimation of Russian military performance in a certain type of conflict, where now we have to reevaluate our assessments. I think there's humanitarian actors are drawing quite concrete lessons of what went wrong with humanitarian corridors, how you help civilians under sieges in the Syrian context, and how that can inform work in Ukraine. And then, quite frankly, diplomatically, after years of being involved in Track 2 work on Syria, the big takeaway that I took from work on the Syrian conflict is that this whole mantra that conflicts cannot be decided by military means sounds quite cynical when you're trying for years to engage in mediation, in diplomacy, invite the other side to Geneva, have all sorts of formats to engage the other side in talks. And meanwhile, the other side is creating military realities on the ground to win this war. So, you know, I have taken away from the Syria case that military realities matter, especially if you want to create a situation in which the other side will negotiate in good faith with you, which is why I'm also quite skeptical vis-a-vis those who argue that now, you know, the Ukrainians should sit down with Russia to negotiate, because I don't think that right now Russia is interested in negotiating in good faith. But that's sort of my personal opinion. Very quickly, 3 other effects of the war on the Middle East region. The big one here is food insecurity and energy prices to mention. We've talked about the reliance of the region on Russian and Ukrainian grain and food imports. And so we've had the blockade for months now, and food prices have already gone up significantly in the Middle East. There's a real concern about famine over coming months. And that whole situation is basically amplifying problems that existed across the Middle East before. You know, Turkey had massive inflation and an economic crisis. In Lebanon, a lot of the grain silos were actually destroyed in the Beirut port explosion 2 years ago, and there was just not a lot of storage left. Syria has been under economic crisis for years. There's been the effect of COVID on the economies of the region. So the point is, things were already quite bad. And then came this additional crisis, food crisis for the region. The second consequence to point to is, what will this greater Russian-Western confrontation mean for the Middle East region? First of all, I think that there will be no direct confrontation. Russia and the Western countries will unlikely take direct military confrontation to the Middle East. You know, they've been close in certain theaters, like in Syria, and there was friction in recent years before the Ukraine war, sometimes between American and Russian forces. But the bottom line was basically that they will not risk, you know, getting into a direct confrontation there, because that could blow up and who knows where it's going to end. There was a concern after the invasion of Ukraine that Russia might lash out against the Americans in Syria. Initially, there was quite some risk aversion and we didn't see anything. And now in the last few weeks, the Pentagon has reported of more unfriendly, unhelpful behavior by Russian forces. So here's a question mark. Is Russia becoming more confident about how things are going in Ukraine, and therefore becoming, again, more risk accepting in other theaters like Syria? I think that is something that has to be observed over the coming weeks. But generally speaking, I think we can unfortunately expect even less cooperation between Russia and Western countries in the Middle East than we even saw before February. Before February, there wasn't a whole lot of cooperation. There was cooperation on humanitarian access for Syria, and then on some arms control and non-proliferation issues. I mean, someone asked about the JCPOA earlier. The Iran nuclear file was for a long time seen as one of those issues that are insulated from whatever else is going on between Russia and the West. And I think there's a big question mark now whether that will be the case going forward. And the final point to mention here is there's a big concern, I think, among Middle Eastern countries that the Ukraine war will further amplify a US rebalancing away from the region, refocusing elsewhere. The United States declaring that China is the, as it calls it, the long-term pacing challenge with which it has to deal with in Indo-Pacific and in Asia. Now there's an acute threat posed by Russia in Europe. if you're the Biden administration and you have to deal with those issues, how much attention will you be able to pay to the Middle East? And what conclusions will regional countries draw from that reality at a time when they see the Iranian nuclear threat as actually becoming more acute? Forget whether we have JCPOA restored or not. I think if you go to Abu Dhabi or Riyadh, people will tell you, even if we have the JCPOA restored, the Iranians are not going to reverse their, the gains that they made in their nuclear program in the last few years. That knowledge, that capability is there to stay. And the Americans are not sufficiently invested in ensuring our security. So based on all of this, I have the strong expectation that this balancing act that states are pursuing between the West and Russia and China will continue, because states in the region feel that they have to also deal with Russia and China as the world is changing in order to be secure. So perhaps I'll leave it at that and we can have a discussion.